our main, one of our main theses, is that's the plural of thesis, right? Is that all the mysticisms have more in common with each other than they do with their mainstream exoteric traditions. And that the mysticisms of different traditions are really very often saying exactly the same thing, or very similar things, or parallel things. And unfortunately, and particularly in the West, that esoteric level is mostly lost.
Yeah, in the West, for example, during the 30 Years' War in Germany between the Protestants and the Catholics, 1/3 of the German population was killed. That's what the West likes to do, is have these wars and massacre large numbers of people rather than, discuss this stuff. So anyway, let me go through what we're going to cover tonight. So you'll see, we're going to do a science piece, and then we're going to do a Gnostic gospel piece, a spiritual piece. So the science piece, we're going to start off with a different video put together by Michael Levin at Tufts University on what's called bioelectricity. And then we'll go into the chakras, and in particular cover some observations that Ron Cowan made of the chakras in his book. I have his book, so you can screen share it and see what he sketched. And then we're going to go to this, again, YouTube video that goes through a comprehensive history of the Gnostic Gospels, but also covers 3 other streams, the surviving stream, which is the Orthodox stream, and then 2 others. And so you'll see that Christianity from, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century was highly fragmented, and it was at the Council of Nicaea that everything was consolidated and put together.
Codified.
Yeah, and then of course the people that didn't go along with this were massacred in the next century. So that's one of the problems, is the only thing we know about this. The victors write the stories, and so they weren't very kind in writing about these other strands. But we do have something from the Dead Sea Scrolls and from Nag Hammadi. So with that, let's get going.
I just want to add one more
Sure, go ahead.
Two more 2 cents. That in my understanding, after years of being involved in Kabbalah and different strands of Buddhism, my belief is that Jesus was really being an exemplary Essene, which was a Jewish strain. He wasn't Christian. He was Jewish, and in particular, he was an Essene. They were vegetarians because they didn't believe you should eat something with eyes to look back at you. And things like that just go right through me. It's just so deep. And that a lot of this is just completely lost, and things end up very polarized and oversimplified, and they're really more complicated and subtle. And there are a lot of teachings about being good to your neighbor in Judaism. It wasn't just an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. That's a Christianization. That's an oversimplification. And look how many Christians have behaved in the name of Christianity, how much slaughter has been committed over the centuries. And it's still very fresh in the minds of Islamic people. The Crusades are not ancient history to them. It's still very real. And they're still learning from it. But I think, unfortunately, what has happened historically is the best of these faith traditions, which do also have their differences, which are very significant, but the best has been hidden away. And this oversimplified exoteric dimension of it, the popular dimension of it, is extremely rigid and artificial and not what the real wise people were saying or teaching or experiencing. And so much of that has become so-called apocrypha, but it's just because it wasn't usurped by the Roman government and the Roman mentality of patriarchy and conquering everything in sight. So we when we talk about Christianity, what do we mean? When we talk about Judaism, I don't think we really know what we mean when we use these terms. And it's not necessarily even what the proponents of these, we could say, philosophies would claim for themselves.
Right.
And who knows? I mean, I'm not saying that I have all the answers either, but I think the truth is often in the esoteric literature, which does still exist. And I'm glad to see more and more of it is coming to the surface and being shared. I took all kinds of vows of secrecy when I was taught Kabbalah in the late 90s, around the turn of the millennium. And now you can find it online and people are sharing it. It's part of the end times, that we're in right now. But so what we're trying to do is like just share the true essence of these traditions. Each one has its own special quality, and that's important. But I think they have far more in common than their differences.
Marjorie, what do you think is the motivation of whomever it was that requested that you provide a vow, like that?
It's the tradition, it was what his teacher did with him. It's to protect it. It can be dangerous. It can be dangerous to yourself. It can be dangerous to other people around you. It's knowledge, and knowledge is power. And, there's this thing like, I think most people believe that Jewish people never say the name of God. Well, that's not true. The practitioners say the name of God all day long. They repeat it as a mantra. It might be kind of, euphemistic, yud hey, vav hey, but that they're saying the name of God, and then they say it with different vowel sounds depending on which energy center they're working on. If you're working on the heart, which is, we'll talk about the heart chakra later, it's the same symbol in Sanskrit and Judaism. It's the Star of David. That's a fire triangle and a water triangle, superimposed. They both associate that with the heart. When you say Yahavaha, you're using the vowel sound of the heart to go with the name of God. That's what the Hasidim in Brooklyn are doing all day long. And my teacher actually gave us prayer beads, like Buddhist prayer beads. We had to make our own, and we alternated between glass and wood. And, it was like a rosary or like a mala in the Buddhist tradition. And that's what we did. We looked at the name of God. We looked at an image of the name of God and said, Yahavaha, Yahavaha. And it opens your heart. It's an energy practice. So I think it's like all of these traditions want to protect the true practices from the profane, because there is energy there is power there. The Buddhists protect their inner teachings as well. When I was going through the worst time of my life with all this court stuff and everything, my intuition was shut down. And I felt it was to protect me and also to protect the people around me, because I had so much rage. I had so much anger. It could have been dangerous. I could have been directing, thoughts at people that I didn't even mean to or want to, that could have been damaging. Does that answer your question?
Well, sort of. I just, there's something that rubs me the wrong way about any kind of, for lack of a better term, fraternal, order that segregates themselves and thinks of themselves as being superior to others. There's just, I guess I'm a little bit too democratic to just, not, feel something, irksome about that.
Right, right. Well, they do have initiations, and they're very real energy practices that I could say change you. I think Bruce would agree. I think it even changes you physiologically. I think an adept could go around and put their hand near somebody's head and say, yes, this person is a meditator, and feel the energy. This person spends a lot of time in prayer and meditation. It changes your aura. It changes your meridians. It changes your behavior.
Is there anything in Buddhist teachings that segregate people that way?
Well, normally in Tibetan Buddhism, in order to do practices, some of the practices with deities, is you have to have the empowerment or permission to practice. But there's an esoteric meaning behind that, because then you get the transmission.
Right.
So it's for a good reason. It's not that it wants to keep it hidden or anything.
Sure.
It's like to be grounded, to run that caliber of electricity, and then so there are these initiations and attunements, and but the person is supposed to have established themselves as a sincere practitioner.
Okay.
I have an interesting story. I'll probably forget it, but if we're talking about did Christ go to India? What happened is that my teacher, Namja Rinpoche, was giving a course in Greece. There's about 30 students there. And a bishop from Hanya, bishop from the Greek Orthodox Church, came and visited Namja Rinpoche. And I was there. There's a few other students who were there too. And it was awesome watching these two very deep religious people talking to one another. I like to share the details at some point, but the one thing that the bishop asked Namja Rinpoche, it was, did he know that Christ went to India? Because it's in the Greek Orthodox tradition that he did. And Namja Rinpoche named the two monasteries where he was. And of course, the bishop asked, does he have any proof? And Namja Rinpoche said, well, the Buddhists aren't interested in that sort of thing. Anyway, it was yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Okay, I'm going to get back to this. We're just to do a short review before we start on this YouTube video. There were a number of people, even going back into like the 1880s, 1890s, who were looking at electricity and how it impacted the human body and could it be used for medicine. So there's all kinds of work being done there. And after World War II, we cited this one guy, Becker, who did a lot of work at Syracuse on this. One of the things, for example, he came up with was he was able to place two electrodes on either side of your head. And if he generated a particular voltage and current and a set of waveforms, you instantly went into a deep sleep. That is, you were in anesthesia, but there was no drugs involved whatsoever. And when the electricity stopped, then you came right out of it, okay? So he was proposing this as a way, for more healthful medicine, that people do get the wrong dose of anesthesia and nothing good happens. So that was just one example of it. And he continued to work on this, but lost his funding because everything had switched over to biochemistry and things of that ilk. Now, that was because of the activity with Watson and Crick in 1953, where it became clear that DNA and RNA were really the controlling entities there that were managing what was going on with cells. And so there was a huge amount of activity that went into this. And part of it, though, that came out was that every cell that you have in your body has a membrane to it. And the membrane is, in fact, has channels through it. And so the channels can allow ions, typically they're sodium or potassium ions, to move in and out of the cell. So if you have a bunch of potassium ions, they lose one electron, so they're slightly positive. That's what makes them an ion. And so if they get outside, then you have more positive stuff outside than inside the cell. The electrons are still back inside the cell. And so this leads to a small voltage potential, typically 20 to 70 millivolts, which is very hard to measure accurately. But every one of your cells, the 50 trillion, 70 trillion cells in your body has this, and this is what's driving things. So what Michael Levin observed was it appears that there's actually an overall electric field that comes about to control a lot of things. And that's what he'll be talking about in this interview here. And that's what the morphogenetic means. The morphology is the form of things. So the question has always come up, if you have an embryo, you have an egg and a sperm, and they combine. So you have one cell, then they split into 2 cells, 4 cells, et cetera. When you get up to a couple hundred cells, he observed an actual electric field there of the sort I just described, with some areas being positive and some being negative. And this started to lead to the formation of the organs of your body. Even though the original, entity, the one cell with the egg and the sperm, there was nothing involved there at all. It was just one uniform thing. So this is one of the mysteries of science, as we'll see. So I'm going to let this rip now for a little bit. We're not going to listen to the whole thing. As you can see, it's 1 hour and 49 minutes, and we're going to go to the 30-minute mark, and I've speeded it up just a little bit so we can get it all. So,
but it's on our website, and you can look at it at your own leisure.
Yeah, and so forth. So here we go.
What non-neural bioelectric states are, their relationship to anatomical results, and then later we can compare and contrast to standard developmental biology for decades, such as the genome that instructs and constructs perhaps what's epigenetic. So we'll start with what are bioelectric, non-neural bioelectric states and their relationship to anatomical results.
Sure. Okay. Well, so non-neural bioelectrical states are simply the fact that all cells in your body, not just neurons, have the same machinery that's normally associated with neural cells. So ion channels, electrical synapses, neurotransmitter pathways, all of these things are way older than nervous systems. And every cell in your body is creating an electrical potential across its membrane. Most cells in your body are communicating those states to their neighbors via these electrical synapses. And on the one hand, people are often surprised to hear this. On the other hand, if you ask yourself, where did neurons and brains come from? They didn't just spring up out of nowhere. Evolution basically speed optimized processes that were already here around the time of bacterial biofilms. They're ancient. These things are ancient. And so if you just sort of track back the phylogeny of nervous systems and neural cells, you find out that all cells have these. And in fact, we've had discussions, very lengthy discussions at some of these basal cognition meetings in terms of what is a neuron. People will say, well, here are neurons, and I'll say, by the way, what's a neuron? And so they'll write on the board 4 or 5 criteria for what they think is a neuron, and then they say, well, every cell does this. And so there are a couple of differences, but most things are fairly universal. And so then the question becomes, well, fine, what are they used? What is this used for? So in the brain, what you have is a system where an electrical network is processing information to direct muscles that move your body through 3-dimensional space. That's behavior, nervous system control of behavior. Prior to that, what these systems were used for were to generate signals that control cell behavior to move your body configuration through anatomical space. That is the space of possible anatomical configurations. So I think, and I'm working on some more stuff on this now in terms of really broadening this idea, but I think what evolution did was pivot some of the same tricks across different spaces. So electrical networks were used to traverse first in evolution, probably first metabolic spaces, and then physiological spaces, and then transcriptional spaces, and then morphous spaces, and eventually three-dimensional space when muscles came on the scene and animals could run around and do things like that. But that's what electrical networks used to think about before they thought about behavior in three-dimensional space. They thought about navigating other types of space.
Now, how does this compare to the standard view, which is just, it's our DNA that programs us?
The standard view is correct in the following sense. What the DNA specifies is the structure of the micro hardware of your cells. So the DNA gives you the protein level sequence, meaning the structure of the proteins that every cell has. That's the hardware. So the DNA is what specifies the hardware of the cells. Now it turns out that hardware is awesome. It's amazing in the following way. When you put that hardware together, it not only has specific sort of default behaviors, but it also has computational capacity, and it's reprogrammable. That's actually one of the most exciting parts about it. But the standard view is that you should be able to very directly go from what's in the genome to the anatomical structures. And I think what that view is missing is a very important middle layer that sits between the hardware and of the anatomy, of the hardware of the genome rather, and the final outcome, this anatomical homeostasis that we see in regeneration and development and so on. And that layer is the software, is the physiological software that links those two things together.
Can you tell me some of the experiments that you've done? Take the audience through a couple of the experiments. So one, you amputate a frog's leg and then you're able to regenerate it, so on and so on. Maybe outline 3 that you find most flabbergasting.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. So here's one. If you use a voltage-sensitive fluorescent dye, which basically just reports, if you flood your tissue with it and it just reports with different types of fluorescence, it reports where the different voltage values are. If you look at the early embryo as it's putting its face together, for example, you will see something we call the electric face. And this was discovered in work with my colleague, Danny Adams, where we found this thing called the electric face, which is basically that prior to all the genes being turned on that are required to make different face components and so on, and certainly prior to the anatomy, there is an electrical pre-pattern that you see in that region that basically looks like a face. You can see where the eyes are going to be because that's where the voltage is different. You can see where the mouth is going to be. You can see where the placodes on the side of the head are going to be. And so you see this electrical face, and it raised the obvious question, which is that if that pattern is instructive, then you ought to be able to do 2 things. You ought to be able to mess it up and thus disrupt that electrical pattern and thus get defects in craniofacial patterning. And certainly you can do that. And in fact, there are even human channelopathies where humans have mutations in ion channels that give them craniofacial birth defects and defects of limb and brain and other things. So that's true. But the other thing, the more exciting thing you might be able to do is to take some of those electrical patterns and move them somewhere else. And you could say, okay, if this is the type of pattern that says to the cells, build an eye here, could we move that electrical state to somewhere else? Not move the cells, but move the electrical pattern, reintroduce that electrical pattern somewhere else and get it to build an eye. And so this is actually, we did this. This is some of our earlier work, around 2007 or so, we discovered this. Basically, you take one ion channel that's able to induce a particular electrical pattern in a region of cells, and you inject RNA encoding that ion channel in some other part of the embryo that's going to be gut. Let's say it's going to make endoderm, it's going to make gut cells. And sure enough, and so 3 things are significant about what happens. The first is that you get an eye, and you get an eye in the middle of the gut. You get an eye constructed from cells that were going to be gut. So this is remarkable because if you look at the developmental biology textbooks, what you will see is that they say that cells outside of the anterior neuroectoderm are not competent to become eyes. They're not supposed to be able to make eyes. And that's true if you use the biochemical master eye gene, PAX6. If you try to induce eyes with PAX6, that's true. It doesn't form it. You can't get ectopic eyes anywhere outside the head. But by introducing this bioelectric pattern, you can. And so that's the first thing that you can go beyond the known competency limits by using this very upstream sort of master regulator, this electrical pattern. The second thing that's interesting about it is that the information content that we provide by putting in this channel is extremely low. We don't micro-specify the details of how to make an eye. Eye has a dozen cell types all arranged in a particular way. We don't know how to do that. We couldn't possibly do. We couldn't possibly do that. In fact, what we do instead is provide a very simple signal that to a programmer basically looks like a subroutine call. Right? It's a trigger. It's a trigger for a cascade that the animal already knows how to do. It already knows how to make eyes. We're not saying how to make an eye. What we're saying is make an eye here, but by triggering that eye building module, which includes all the gene expression, everything else that's downstream. So that modularity, that incredible engineering trick that says that you can call up, once you know how to do something, you can reuse it in other places. The fact that these bioelectrical states are triggers of developmental subroutines. Okay, so that's kind of the second cool thing about it. The third cool thing about it is that if you label the cells that you are injecting the channel RNA into with a color, so you can tell which cells actually got the extra channel, and then you look at that eye that you've created. What you will see is that often, for example, half the eye will have the channel you put in, the other half of the eye doesn't have it. That means that what the cells that you affected, what they did was they recruited their normal neighbors, right? Which by themselves were never modified by you. They were completely wild type. And yet they got recruited by their neighbors to be part of this thing. So there's two levels of instruction here. There's instruction by us saying to a region, you make an eye. And then there's a secondary instruction by those cells that say, oh, and by the way, I'm going to need more cells. Hey, you guys over here, you're going to be part of this lens. And they all come, and even the ones that we never directly affected. And so this third part is cool because, well, the second part is cool. The fact that it's modular and a trigger is cool because that means that you can achieve regenerative medicine outcomes, things that are way too complex for us to micromanage, by using triggers. If we can identify the triggers of the subroutines that we want, make an eye, make a limb, make a liver, then we can trigger those things long before we actually know all the details about how to micromanage it, right? So part of reverse engineering, and I very much see this as a reverse engineering test, part of reverse engineering is finding out all the cool hooks in the system that are already there for you. Not that you have to put them together from scratch, but they're already there for you. You know, what is the trigger that's the build an eye subroutine? What other subroutines are there, right? That's part of our job. The thing that's cool about that third part is that it's non-cell autonomous, meaning you can exert effects on cells without touching them directly because cells communicate to each other. So by convincing a bunch of cells over here that they should make an eye, you in effect affect a bunch of other cells and cause them to be part of that eye without having to touch them directly. And that comes up.
Sorry, that's what you meant when you were talking about recruiting
earlier? Exactly right. Yeah. So that's kind of the first. That's the first example that I would talk about. The second example I would talk about has to do with cancer. And so,
Michael, is it okay if we hold on that cancer result? Because what you said was so profound, and I want to unpack it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we'll hold on.
Tell me if this is broadly correct. Let's imagine I'm a frog. The frog is developing. Before an eye or a stomach or a throat or whatever it is made, you see some adumbration, some electrical adumbration, like a hint of it. And then what you can do is you can say, well, there's some pattern. Let's imagine it's a circle, to be simplistic. There's some circular voltage gradient, and that means I. So what if I induce that? What if I induce a voltage gradient over here near the heart? I know you said something, but whatever, over here. Then what will happen is instead, ordinarily we would think, well, you need to micro-tune that eye, each molecule. It's extremely difficult to make an eye. We don't actually know how to, from the bottom up molecularly make an eye, but we see this pattern. What if we put that pattern on the heart or the stomach? Oh, lo and behold, sometime amount later, then an eye is born. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And the only thing I would add to that, first of all, is that the reason I was telling you about that electric face pattern is because it's kind of the most obvious one, in the sense that the electric face pattern actually looks like a face. You can't miss it. It just looks like a face. But not all of them are that simple. Some of them are really they're encoded more deeply, such that by staring at it, you can't tell what it's going to be, right? So for example, there are other patterns that we've seen where the only way we know what they are is by watching what they make. You couldn't have guessed, you know. So some of them are very direct, almost a paint by numbers. You can sort of see what's going to happen, and others are really complicated, and you need computational tools to deep involve what you're looking at to figure out what it's going to be. So not all of them are as obvious as the electric face pattern, right?
Yeah, one of the questions I had was, why hasn't this been found out before? Was there a technological limit, or did they just not look at cells with the dye that give an indication of voltage gradients or optogenetic technologies and so on?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Why not before? I mean, on the one hand, everything has to have a beginning at some point, right? So whenever it was, you would have, you could have asked, well, like, why not before, right?
But hindsight is always obvious.
You can always say that, but let's kind of dig into that. On the one hand, there was a conceptual leap that kept this pretty much under. I mean, let's be clear. I am not the first person to talk about the importance of bioelectric signals. People have been studying endogenous bioelectricity since before 1900. So it certainly has occurred to people that maybe electrical signals are important in development regeneration. All of my work, I was incredibly heavily inspired by work that was done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s by a bunch of people that worked really hard on this stuff. The reason that it hadn't gone far enough was two reasons. Number one, the tools weren't there. So these dyes didn't exist. All they had was traditional electrophysiology. In traditional electrophysiology, you have one electrode and you're poking it into cells. And if you want to have a picture of what's going on, you got to poke all the cells. And that's just completely impractical, right? These dyes didn't exist. The conceptual thing was that around the time that this stuff was taking off, using electrodes and things like that, biochemistry and molecular biology took off. And the reason molecular biology drew all the attention is because you could do molecular biology and biochemistry in dead, fixed tissue. So you can kill and fix your cells, and you can sequence the DNA, you can sequence the RNA, you can get a proteome, you can get all of these kinds of things you can do. None of that is possible with bioelectrics. So the minute your cell is dead, all of it goes away. So none of the typical omics approaches work. So it's that much harder. And so it really lagged behind because all the interest went into the molecular, kind of molecular biochemistry, and it had to wait for some of these tools to come up. The third thing is that I think while people did think about the importance of these bioelectric gradients, nobody, to my knowledge, before we did it, really thought about it as the beginnings of the nervous system, and to really put that computational spin on it, the fact that this thing really is like a neural network doing computations about development. I think that's new. I will say, Harold Burr, who's this guy who was working in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Okay, he had one of the first good voltmeters around, and he went around measuring things, elm trees and rabbits and tumors and embryos and all kinds of stuff. On the basis of this, he wrote an amazing book that basically said most of the things that we're discovering now. The guy had a crystal ball. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. So he could clearly see a lot of this stuff. The one thing he did not see, because at the time it didn't exist, was the computational aspects and the link to to this as a kind of neuroscience done in another space, in morpho space. That I think is new. But people had already had these ideas, and it needed the technology to really prove them out and to really see how it works.
I'll be showing people some overlays of some of the cells with the blue and green and red voltage colors. Now, voltage is actually fairly abstract for most people, but what's not abstract is something like an electron. People can fathom that has a certain charge. So when someone is looking at these videos of voltage gradients and the colored, what is one seeing? Essentially, I'm asking you to explain what voltage is simply, but in terms of electrons, in terms of something that people can understand.
Yeah.
In order to understand voltage, you have to understand potential, and you also have to understand fields technically if you want to understand that correctly.
Yeah, it's not so bad. You don't need to really do much with fields in this one at all, because all of the things that I'm talking about are really not fundamentally fields per se. They're just spatial distributions of voltage gradients. And to understand a voltage gradient, it's pretty simple. Instead of electrons, life uses electrons too, but mostly the kinds of stuff that we're talking about uses a different charged particle. They use potassium, chloride, sodium, and protons. Okay, but otherwise same deal. And so any cell has a cell membrane around it, the outer surface, and it has these ion channels, which are these little portals, these little proteins that can open and close and let specific ions like potassium or sodium in and out. These potassium and sodium are both positively charged. So you can imagine that if you're a cell and you let a bunch of your positively charged potassiums out, you can have an imbalance, more positives out here, less positives inside. So now there's going to be a voltage gradient, basically a battery in effect. I mean, that's basically what a battery is, right? It's a membrane with a charge disbalance across it. That's all this is. So every cell is a battery. It achieves that by using energy to pump ions in a particular direction. And as a result, if you were to take a tiny little voltmeter and put it across, and that's exactly what electrophysiologists do, you put it across that cell membrane, you're going to read a voltage of some sort. It's usually somewhere between 20 millivolts and 70 millivolts, something like that, right? That's all it is. And so now you imagine doing that for every cell in the tissue that you're looking at, and you're just going to color every cell depending on how big that voltage difference is. You're going to color it red if the voltage difference is quite small. That's called being depolarized, meaning there's just not that much imbalance. It's quite similar. The ions inside and outside are pretty similar. So you're going to color those red. And then the ones that are really different, where there's a ton of positive charges that have been kicked out, so the cell is really pretty negative, that compared to the outside space, that you're going to color those. You're going to color those blue. And that's what you're looking at.
Great. Okay, so now we have some background as to what some DNA codes for proteins, and you can think of that as low level, and then what you're discovering, and you and your teams and the teams that you collaborate with are discovering is that there's these non-neural bioelectric signals, and those are somewhat like large-scale code. Some of the implications are regeneration of limbs, barely touched on, that's okay. We touched on generation of generation of eyes, not regeneration of eyes, and then you were about to get into cancer, so do you mind?
Yeah, just real quick to say, the analogy is, I think a good analogy is this: the DNA is what encodes the hardware. Okay, and the electrical dynamics are the software. Now, a lot of people get upset at this because they say, living things are not like a computer. So I am certainly not claiming that living things are like the kind of computers that you and I use on a daily basis. This architecture is not what life is using. However, the deeper concept from computer science, which is the idea of reprogrammable hardware and the idea of software, multi-layer software, where you could be programming in machine code, or you could be looking for higher level subroutines and higher level languages. That I think is quite realistic. And I think what we're looking for here is to understand, basically to find the best representation of that software, so that we can manipulate it as to advantage, basically, and to understand how evolution manipulates it. And so the other, you had asked for 3 examples. So there are 3 basic examples I wanted to give. So the electric face was one. There's a cancer example, and then there's a planarian flatworm regeneration example. So the cancer example would look like this. One of the things about cancer, one way to think about cancer is to ask the question, why is there ever anything but cancer? In other words, individual cells like amoebas are extremely competent on their own. They handle single cell level goals quite well. Why do they ever get together to form something like a kidney or a liver? Because when there's a cancer, what you're seeing is a defection from that process. You're seeing cells that normally should be working on making a nice organ or upkeeping a nice organ in an adult. Instead of that, they go off and they basically revert to a single cell kind of existence. They basically become like an amoeba. They treat the rest of the body as just environment. It's like external environment. So you can think of that computational boundary between self and world can shrink. It can grow when a bunch of amoeba-like cells get together and they build something like an organ or a whole body. That computational boundary grows. It can also shrink because an individual cell can say, I'm not working on this anymore. I'm just an amoeba and I'm going to do what amoebas do. What do? They become two amoebas, and two amoebas become four, and so on. They over-proliferate and they go where life is good. So they metastasize to wherever they want to go. So that's cancer. So if you think about it that way, that cancer is this like defection from multicellular cooperation. You ask yourself, okay, so what is the process that normally keeps them harnessed towards specific goals? And so if you ask yourself, what do we know that's a process that harnesses individual competent subunits towards larger scale goals? That's very clear. That's the neural-like processing, because you have individual neurons, which are cells, but you connect them together into a network, and this amazing computation starts to take place that can do things like plan for the future and have memories and have preferences and goals on a large scale. You as an organism can have goals and memories that your individual cells don't have. So we know that electrical networks are really good at binding small competent subunits into larger scale computational agents. We take advantage of that in computer science. Evolution takes advantage of it in making neurons. So we asked the following question: okay, could that be the basis of cancer? And now I must say that we're not the first to have this idea. Okay, again, Harold Burr said this in the 30s. So we did three things. We said, okay, first of all, when this process happens, can you see, using the voltage dyes, can you see the cells defecting from the electrical network? And in fact, you can. So what you can do is before it happens, so you can inject a human oncogene, which is going to form a tumor in the tadpole. You inject that into a tadpole. It makes a tumor, and even before that tumor becomes apparent, you can see with a voltage dye, you can see that those cells become highly depolarized. They electrically uncouple from the rest of the tissue, and they go on their way. And they just treat, to them, the rest of the animal is just external environment at that point. So they become electrically uncoupled, and that's the first thing that oncogenes do, is electrically isolate the cell from its neighbors, from that collection of signals that normally tell the cell what to do in a larger context. So that's the first thing we did. The second thing we did, we said, well, if that's a potential cause of cancer, could we cause cancer just by disrupting the electrical communication directly? No oncogenes, no carcinogens, no DNA damage, no mutations, nothing wrong with the cells that any molecular biology test could see. And could we cause cancer? Because remember, the standard model in the field for years has been that cancer is the cause of genetic damage, basically, right? That it's a genetic disruption that makes a rogue cell that has other mutations and so on. So we said, fine, no, we're going to take completely normal cells, nothing wrong with them, and we're going to simply prevent them from talking to other cells electrically. Okay, we're just going to manipulate that. And so we did that, and sure enough, we made metastatic melanoma in tadpoles. So that tells you that there doesn't have to be anything wrong with the hardware in order to have cancer. It can be a purely physiological phenomenon. It can be caused at the software level, which a lot of people who study stress-induced cancers and things like this, they kind of already knew. But really, the paradigm has been that there has to be a genetic defect at the root of this somewhere. Okay. And then the third thing we found, which is of course the most exciting thing, which is you can go in the opposite direction. You can inject a really powerful human oncogene, like a p53 mutation.
Oncogene, for those who are listening, is just a gene that causes cancer.
Yeah, an oncogene is a mutation in the normal gene that causes that is thought to cause cancer transformation to cancer. Yeah. Okay. So you can inject that, and then if you do that into a tadpole, if you at the same time inject an ion channel that forces the cell to remain in an electrical state where it's connected to its neighbors and it doesn't depolarize, then even though that oncogene is blazingly strongly expressed, you won't have a tumor, because you're overriding that. There's a hardware problem, but it doesn't matter because you're overriding it and saying, yeah, I know you want to depolarize, but you can't. You have to stay connected to these neighbors, and you're just going to be part of this. And we can override that way a variety of different types of oncogenes.
Okay, so I was just having an analogy in my head. It's almost like, imagine you have these kids and they're misbehaved. So you can say, well, it's the kids who are the problem and they cause havoc in the house. But if you have an adult who's stern enough, they can override the misbehaved kids. If you leave the kids without the adult, then the house will be in shambles. In this analogy, the adult is like the electrical communication. So you can force that electrical communication, that standard adaptive electrical communication.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. I mean, the thing where I think it breaks down a little bit is that we're not introducing an extra element that keeps everybody else in line, right? We're in effect, it's like you have a bunch of kids that know what to do, and you've got one that's wearing dark glasses and he can't see, and he's causing all kinds of trouble because he can't see what he's doing. Well, you can put a camera on him or take the glasses off or something so that he just goes right back into the interactions with the rest of the the rest of the group. It's about communication. It's about binding the individual competent subunits towards a larger goal. Your goal is not simply to grow as much as you can, the way an amoeba is. Your goal is to build a hand or a liver or an eye or something else. It's really about the scale up of goals, and electrical networks are great for this.
Does your work have any implications for what it means to have an identity? So right now you were talking about cancer as if it's dissociating from the larger self.
Yeah,
And then there are gap junctions, which you referenced in your other work. And they effectively make an equivalence class between signals that I generate as a cell or my environment, or signals from connected cells. I'm unable to tell the difference between them.
Yep.
Because I'm unable to tell the difference between myself and my neighbor, it's as if I'm identified with them. So it has plenty of bearing, at least I see it has plenty of bearing as for what it means for the I or the ego in a non-pejorative manner. So what are the implications of your work for the concept of identity?
No, you put your finger exactly on it. So 2 years ago, I wrote this paper called On the Boundary of the Self, and it's exactly this idea. It's the way to define what is a self at different scales, and how does the boundary, the size of that self, change over time. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about. It's having communication channels that partially wipe the metadata on information so that I no longer know whether it came from you or whether it came from me, right? Gives us a partial mind melt, because now it's really hard to keep an identity. If I can't tell which are my memories and which are your memories, it's really hard for us to keep a distinct identity. So we become partially unified. And that's exactly the sort of process that evolution exploits to build larger selves out of small competent ones.
Another astounding experiment of yours, I'm not sure if I should be calling it an experiment, was where you took skin cells of a frog and then it has locomotion. Can you outline what the heck did you do there and why is that important?
No, it's definitely an experiment. So you're talking about our Xenobots, I think, and the question that we're interested in addressing is basically this: where do anatomical goals come from? And in order to illustrate why that's even a good question, I want to talk about planaria for just a moment, and then you'll see why this is important for the Xenobots. We are used to the fact that each species has a specific shape that is associated with it, and that frog eggs make frogs, and zebrafish eggs make zebrafish, and so on. So we're kind of used to that. But the actual question of how do cellular collectives decide what they're going to build and when do they stop building, that's very much an open question. And so one way you can see how far we are away from a good understanding of this is in a very simple experiment. There are round, so planaria are these flatworms that regenerate. When you cut them into pieces, every piece builds whatever's missing and they regenerate. Okay, that's planaria. You can cut them into pieces and every piece regenerates to a normal planaria. So there are species of planaria that have round heads, and those cells are really good at building a round head and then stopping. So they stop when a round head is complete. Okay. Then you got another species of planaria that has a very pointy head, kind of a triangular head. And those cells are very good at making a triangular head. When you cut it off, it makes a triangular head and then it stops. So I have a simple question. If I take a bunch of the cells from the round-headed guy and I stick them into the body of the triangular guy, and I let them sort of get comfortable and sit around for a little while, then I cut the head off. What head shape are we going to have? Are we going to have, is one of the head shapes dominant to the other? Are we going to have an intermediate shape? Or are we going to have a planarian that never stops regenerating because neither set of cells is ever happy about the shape? That stop condition is never set. Okay, so now look, the important thing is not the answer. The important thing is, despite all of the papers in Nature and Science about the molecular pathways of control of stem cells and planaria and all these kinds of high resolution transcriptomics and all this stuff, there is not a single model in the field that makes a prediction on this experiment. Why? Because every piece of data out there now addresses the hardware that enables individual cells to do cell things. Fine. But we have no understanding of what happens when the cells join together into a larger scale self that makes large scale decisions about head shape, head number, things like that in morphospace, that navigates morphospace by making these large scale decisions. We have absolutely no idea how those algorithms work. And the fact that we know how the stem cells work and have lots of molecular biology about that really hasn't affected this other question much at all. We just have no models for this.
Because it's too computationally complex, or some other in-principle reason?
I don't think it's because it's too complex, although it is too complex to calculate out directly. I think it's because conceptually we haven't found the right We haven't found the right way to think about how cellular collectives make decisions. This is a collective intelligence problem. This is not a molecular biology problem. We've been thinking about this as a molecular biology problem. That's not what this is. This is trying to read the mind of a collective intelligence. Now, people think of collective intelligences as exotic things like anthills and bee colonies and things like this. These are collective intelligences. I want to remind everybody that we are all collective intelligences. We are all bags of cells. No, there is no cognitive agent that is like this single diamond that's not made of parts. That's sort of unchanging. We're all made of parts. Any cognitive agent is made of parts. And so your goal is to ask, how do those parts bind together to make decisions as a collective? Individual cells don't know what a head is. They don't know what round means. They don't know what triangular means. But the collective sure does. And so the collective is able to navigate morphospace in this way that we don't understand the algorithm. So we don't even know how to think about this. Okay. So this is very isomorphic to problems in neuroscience, to problems in artificial intelligence. It's trying to understand the scaling of minds. And in trying to do that, we pose the following problem. Okay, standard tadpoles make standard frog eggs make frog embryos, and everybody's kind of used to that. Even though you can I always remind my students, did you realize that if I gave you the frog genome, you couldn't tell me what a frog looked like, right? You could compare it to other genomes that you did know, but that's cheating. So okay, so we asked a simple question: where does the goal of making a frog or tadpole really come from, and how hardwired is that? So what we did was we took some skin that we scraped off of an early frog embryo. We set it aside in a different environment. And we said, okay, now you're free to sort of reboot your multicellularity. You're here. We've relieved all of the constraints of the rest of the embryo. You're no longer getting instructive signals from endoderm and from mesoderm and from all these other things. You're no longer subject to all these other signals. What are you going to do? What's your new what do you want to do? And there's a couple of different options that could have happened. The cells could have died. They could have wandered off and sort of let each cell go its own way. They could have made a monolayer of cells in a dish, the way you get in cell culture. All kinds of things they could have done. They didn't do any of that. What they did instead was to combine together and to form a little ball that grew cilia, these little motile hairs on the outer surface. Now, cilia are normally sitting on the outside of embryos, and they're there to kind of redistribute the mucus around and to make the pathogens sort of keep moving and not stick to the skin. They're used to keep the surface of the tadpole clean. But instead, these cells basically repurposed that genetically encoded hardware. The cilia themselves are genetically encoded. All the proteins necessary to make a cilium are in the genome, so they have that already. But what they did was they assembled themselves into a new kind of architecture, this spherical thing, and then they used the cilia to propel themselves. So they started running around. They started moving around. And so we have these amazing videos of them moving around singly, moving around in groups, interacting, going through a maze, going back and forth in various configurations. They have all kinds of behaviors. They have all kinds of, they can regenerate. If you cut them almost entirely in half, they will like join back and make a xenobot again. And so the coolest thing about them is, and by the way, we don't know their cognitive capacities yet. Okay, we're only beginning now to start to see, can they learn, do they have preferences, all these kinds of things. We don't know yet. But the coolest thing about them is that, to my knowledge, they're the only creature on the planet that doesn't really have an evolutionary backstory. The individual cells do. Okay, the cells have a long evolutionary history on Earth, but they were selected that genome was selected for the ability of these cells to sit quietly on the outside of the frog and keep up the pathogens. They were not selected specifically to be able to get together and run around in a separate configuration away from the embryo. Where did that all come from? And in fact, one of the things about it is people often say, well, when are you going to engineer these things? Knock in various synthetic biology circuits, right? Make them do things. And we absolutely will do that. But my goal, before we do any of that, my goal was to show people what can happen, the diversity that can happen from the exact same genome with no manipulations whatsoever. Because the thing about these xenobots is they just have a normal frog genome. They have no transgenes, no genomic editing. There's nothing different about them. What we're seeing is the plasticity of this collective intelligence that is able to make a new functional proto-organism in a novel way out of the exact same parts.
So there's no genomic editing there. Did you manipulate its morphogenetic code, the electrical signals at all?
Not yet. No, we're going to. We're certainly going to. That's all to come. No, at this point we haven't done that. This is purely native plasticity. This is what these cells already know how to do. We scrape them off of the frog, and we put them in little holes, little sort of depressions. And I should back up. There are two types of xenobots. Okay, the one I'm describing now, we literally did almost nothing. You scrape them off the embryo, you set them aside, and you say, fine, now liberated from all the signals that would have turned you into various things, what do you want to do? And this is what they do on their own. There's another type of Zenobot, which is actually the one we started with, where we sculpted them a little bit. And this is, by the way, this is all work done in collaboration with Bongard Lab at University of Vermont, and Sam Kriegman did all the computational modeling for this, and then Doug Blackiston did all the microsurgery and everything. We sculpted them a bit to give them legs. So you basically just, it's subtractive, like subtractive sculpting. You just cut away some stuff so that you're left with kind of an ottoman that has like four legs, you know. And we put in a little bit of muscle, and then it learned to walk. So the muscle would contract, and the thing would basically walk along. That's the first set of Xenobots we made. The second one has no muscle, it has no nerve, it's only skin, and those can get around perfectly well on their own using these cilia. And there, our interventions are extremely minimal.
It's important that it was taken off of embryos, or it doesn't matter if you took it off of a frog much later in development.
We haven't taken it off a frog later in development, but we have other evidence that I can't really talk about yet that suggests that it doesn't matter that it's a frog, and it doesn't matter that it's an embryo. We have data on adult cells now.
What occurs to me is, I'm wondering.
Okay, so I'm going to just stop this here. You get the flavor of what's going on here. It's you know, again, this is cutting edge stuff, and you know, we'll see where it all goes when all is said and done. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go back to what I said we were going to do, which is chakras. So let me go to screen share for this.
Did anybody else think that was scary?
It's pretty profound.
No, not scary.
Scary.
Oh, it's you know, it's suggestive of, you know, how little we know. I mean, it's all. But what can you say? This is to me very amazing stuff. I've taken a lot of online classes in modern biology, biochemistry, genomics, all of these things, and you won't find any of this in you know, the tens of courses that I've taken. So you know, this is leading edge, you know, research. So
I have to share something about what they said. So the fact that they took cancer cells and the electrical current. I listened to a textbook by a PhD who interviewed cancer patients that had radical remissions. And one of the treatments that some people used were electromagnetic fields that
Right.
they in essence emerge themselves in at a certain frequency in order to stop the cancer cells from proliferating. So this makes basically this, you know, validating that should work.
Yeah,
If you get the right
there's a
frequency.
60-minute segment I looked at where an Israeli company took someone where the CAT scan showed that 2/3 of the person's skull was filled up with cancer, okay, the brain. The person wore a wire mesh connected to a battery pack that generated some sort of signals. He just wore this for, you know, 9 months. At the end of 9 months, you couldn't find any evidence of this cancer. Okay, it was gone. I just received a notice of a paper that Michael Levin and his colleagues published, where they went in again into the brain, you know, for someone using, again, modern pharmaceuticals to go do this ion channel manipulation, and they cured this incredibly ghastly brain cancer. It's basically gone in this person. So with the same tricks he's talking about. So it's
Wow.
a, you know, you can see that the ramifications for medicine would be huge. We just don't know what we don't know right now.
Yep.
I'm going to switch now to hold on one sec.
Well, a lot of this is actually, I think, what acupuncture does.
Yeah, the acupuncture is dealing with the meridians that are, again, all over your body, linking these different points to the different organs to different points on your body. And so it is activating an electrical transfer. An electrical field is being changed there, which is causing these things to happen. And And that's just done with needles, passive needles, not, they don't even generate, there's no battery there doing anything other than your body. So, okay, so now I'm just going to run off to this piece on chakras, and we'll get to what Ron Cowan observed. So chakras are the various focal points that people use in meditation, and they show up in different traditions, in Hinduism, for example, in yoga, and so forth. So some people, for example, there's a discussion where there's 5 chakras in some Buddhist texts, and Hindu sources have 6 or even 7. We're going to deal with 7 here. Seems that that's the popular thing. But early Sanskrit texts speak of these chakras as meditative visualizations combining flowers and mantras and as physical entities in the body. And within the practice of Kundalini yoga, where we're thinking of, if you will, energy moving up and down your spine, connecting the different chakras that are there, along with breath exercises and visualizations and so forth, that the flow of this energy through the can be done through these chakras. Okay, so the modern Western system that we're talking about here really came about in the 1880s, and then there was some more work. And Leadbeater, as we saw in 1927, wrote a book on this. But they ended up with Leadbeater having 7 rainbow colors for the chakras, which we'll get to. You'll see this, and so forth. So things like Kabbalah and Tarot were added later on, but they have correspondences with alchemy, with astrology, with homeopathy, you name it. So the Hindu Vedas and the Rig Veda in particular seem to talk about these things. The breath channels that are there go back into the Upanishads in the first millennium BC, and there's all kinds of energy chakra theories floating around. The idea was to introduce energy centers in the 8th century of the Christian era, of the Common Era, and they have these different names, which we'll run through in a second, and so it goes. So there's a huge collective literature on chakras, okay, but they're basically claimed to be arranged in a column from the base of the spine on up to the top of the head, and they're connected by some sort of vertical channels. One of the problems with all of this is that, for example, until someone like Ron Cowan went and did his observations, there really aren't any observations of any of this. Okay, it's a framework to talk about it, but no one knows, really what's going on here. And the main difference here in the chakra system for Hinduism and Buddhism from acupuncture is that the chakra relates to what's called the subtle body, where it has a position or someplace inside the body, but doesn't really identify with a physical organ. Okay, it's related to it. Whereas the Chinese side of things, with acupuncture, you are actually tying a physical organ to these meridians that are there. There's a lot of other places where this appeared, and it goes on and on. So the most common system that we're going to talk about here is the Western system, is the thing to keep in mind. The Theosophical Society was very active in popularizing this, and that led to a lot of activity today. So let's go off and see what in the world did Ron Cowan see. So he has his book, The Path of Love, Making Buddhism into a Science, is, I believe, what the subtitle is here. But you see this picture here. What is this picture he's got on the cover of the book? It's a color picture of the crown chakra. So he went ahead and he went into deep meditation, and he tried to go dig into, maybe his own head. I don't know. The crown chakra is there someplace, and he drew this picture. So I'm going to get out of this. Hold on one sec. I'm going to go over to his book, and we're going to, hold on one sec. Okay, so here's the book, and I go back here to screen share, and
Not that.
here it is. Okay, so here's his book. I went to part 7, the chakras. So he did sketches of what he called evolution of intelligence. So the chakras and the nadis that evolved to their present form long before there was any biological life. Meaning that what's happening here is these entities, these chakras, are really what we would call subquarks. So they're on the subnuclear scale, but they're made up of what today we would call dark matter. And just a sec, I've got to get Judith in. Hold on one sec. I'm going to rename her.
Oh, you're taking away her name?
That is not her name. I know that.
It's her secret name.
So here we go. We got her in. Okay. So these happen to lie again along the spinal column is what it is, but they're in a separate subspace is what we're conjecturing here. That's what Ron observed. And in the subspace, we talked about this. There's 24 spatial dimensions that we have. And so we have the 3 that we have our physical body in for breadth, length, and width. And then there's 3 more for dark matter, which are for breadth, length, and width. And so at the same point that we're talking about, but in a separate subspace is where these chakras or nadis are. And then what goes with this is there's all those compactified dimensions that we skipped over, the other 18 compactified dimensions that go with each space. And that's what provides the linkage, the coordination, the communication between these different chakras that are there in your body. And collectively, this is what we would call a soul. So the thing that Ron said, let me just go back to read it, okay? The structure here is a very sophisticated structure, and the organization evolved in response to the world of shadow matter or dark matter, okay? So because they're in this other subspace, they have other things that they end up doing. Their organization is so complex that when he used his clairvoyance, which he called micro-psi, to zoom in on the microscopic levels to discern the function or purpose of any of these things, these subquarks basically have clustered together like a fungus or like a coral reef would grow. So you just have this amorphous structure here. And when he tried to look and try and find a function that was different from functions in other adjacent structures, he started to realize it would have taken him multiple lifetimes to discover just the most basic stuff. And so he chose not to really do anything more than document what he saw. So that's what we're going to see here. So the first one is the crown chakra, the very top of your head. And we saw the color picture of it. Here's the black and white picture. The Kindle that I have only functions in black and white. If you get sorry, this is the PC reader version of his book. And so they didn't capture the color, but anyway, this is what we have for what the crown chakra looks like. And your guess is as good as mine as to what all this stuff is doing. That's there on the crown. So when we drop down a little bit to the third eye, so the point in between the two eyes, but up a little bit on your forehead, but back in your brain, he has a picture here of what this looks like with all of these other functions here. So now dropping down from the third eye, we get down to the throat chakra, which is for communication. So here we have a picture of this. The thing goes up all over the place, and so it goes. Then we go down to the heart chakra, which in these traditions is viewed as kind of the center of everything. The heart chakra is really where all the action is. Yeah, and we're going from the more sophisticated, the more complex, down to the less and less complex. So we're now in the middle. The heart chakra is here, and we're moving down from that to the water chakra by your belly button. But hidden behind, it's hidden behind the fire chakra. So it shows up here as this dashed line here is what he's got it in. And so he redrew it so it's behind and below, and it has this oval shape that you see here. Okay. Now the fire chakra is below that, and that would be between, again, your belly button and the base of your spine. Many times this has, some ties to sex, and he has a picture here from something from a male, and he simply said that the female is very different. So you can take that for whatever it means. And then finally we get down to the root chakra, which down at your end of your spine. Again, it's in a separate subspace, so that's why people haven't seen these things, is like, where are they? And you end up with this picture here. He has a fan-like structure that he says goes outside the body, okay, no less, and then a grass-like structure that goes down to the ground, not simply from your tailbone, but it goes all the way down to the ground. And then he observed some sort of vortex, and then a different vortex here, and so it goes. So this is, I thought, truly amazing, him trying to draw these pictures. We don't have a clue what this means. It's just indicative of the mystery of all of this. But collectively, these chakras appear to make up what would be called a soul or a spirit that is linked to your body, and it links at birth apparently, and it disengages when you die, and so it goes. So that's our discussion of chakras and so forth. Now, we're going to switch topics. So let me ask, again, all of this is on the website, so you can take a look. Any discussion, any questions about any of this stuff they've just run through with Michael Levin, or this discussion on chakras?
I just wanted to ask Marge a question about 7 in the Jewish tradition. It represents a complete or a whole. Am I right there?
Well,
Marge, can you hear me?
Yes. I'm not sure I understand your question, so I'll take a stab at it. Do you mean the whole tree?
The 7 days in the week.
Yes. It's said
the
to
number
work
7
on
represents
various levels.
or a whole cycle.
On one level, it represents the solar system with the 7 classical planets. And it is likened to the chakra system, but different. So on a microcosmic level, it can represent a person. And on a macrocosmic level, it can represent the solar system, for example. But it could go up from there and be, a galaxy and the universe. So it's kind of holographic. And it said that each sephira, which is like a sphere on the tree, contains the entire tree in replica.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Yes, thank you. And what you also got me thinking about the fact that the energy systems you know, I think if you could view a person's energy field and from a sick person, and you would be able to identify the plant that had a corresponding field that would heal that sickness in that person.
That's, that's very interesting. It's said in acupuncture that there are a few places where there are miniature, holographs of the human body, and one place is in the ear, so they call it the little man in the ear. The feet are also said to contain, these miniature replicas. So if for some reason you can't work on the particular organ or area of the human body, you can work on that other level that corresponds and have the same effect. I know a lot of traditions say that the gut is a microcosm of the entire body, and that if you knew how to, there's a correspondence between every segment of the intestine, the large intestine, that corresponds to every organ of the body and every disease process of those organs. So some, as I'm saying, sometimes an acupuncturist, or I imagine in other traditions as well, they'll work on the microcosm if for some reason they can't work on the macrocosm. So they'll find the specific place, like where the liver is in your ear, if they don't want to work physically on the area of your liver in your body.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You're talking mainly about the 7 main chakras in the body.
Yes.
Because from what I have read, with the energy fields around the egg shapes going out, we actually have 12, but of course there's other smaller ones, they say.
Right.
Yeah, the 7 are the 7 main ones. You're entirely correct, Judith. There's many more, and we're just trying to touch on these things. Yeah. Yeah.
200 and something or something, they say.
Yes, that's right.
And
Yeah.
above our body, beyond the physical
Remember,
body,
the thing underlying this is this dark matter that we're talking about. We touched on this early on, that 5% of the universe is matter, 27% is dark matter, and the rest is dark energy. So if I just divide 5 into 27, I see that more than 5 times the matter in the universe is dark matter. So we have little pieces of dark matter in us, apparently, that make up these chakras all over the place. And the same thing is going to be true of when we look at the trees and the plants and all the animals around us. They also are going to have this, okay? But the key thing is that it doesn't have an electron associated with it. So therefore, the only thing that it can respond to is something like gravity, or a vibration of some sort of shaking. And that's where we get to this thing that I forgot to include, these so-called solfeggio frequencies that people have come up with some tones that resonate with each of these main chakras. And I'm just gonna skip forward here so you can see what I'm talking about. The root chakra is down there at 396 hertz, and the sacral at 417. And just for a point of reference, I believe A is 440 hertz, okay? And all of these are sounds that put the chakra into a proper state. If it resonates with this, then it shakes off all of the bad states that it might be in, and then you're safe. So the root chakra is at the very root is dealing with liberating you from guilt and fear. The sacral chakra is undoing situations and facilitating change. The solar chakra, the one by your belly button, is transformation and miracles, or DNA repair. Then we go to the heart chakra, which is for connecting and for relations. So these got to be more complex. Okay, they were going to higher orders here in this. The throat chakra is for expressions and solutions. That's communications is occurring here. And the brow or the third eye is returning to the spiritual order. And so when we get up here to these different things, we end up with different aspirations. So here's the picture that you typically will find on the web showing these things, and the colors go from it's earth, air, water, fire. So the fire is kind of at the bottom, and we have some blue here for water, and some earth in here, and at the very top, the crown chakra is the most I'd say highest, most intellectual, most abstract, and it's even outside of your body. And collectively, these appear to generate auras that are around your body that again are in these other subspaces. So we can't measure these things, but just included it. So this is all in the handout that you're going to get. So I'm going to just close things there. But we're now going to jump back to these Gnostic Gospels and in the survey there. So there any other questions? Anything else anyone has? Again, you'll get the recording, you'll get the handout. Just give a yell.
No, I just wanted to add that 12 was also a significant number in the Jewish tradition with the 12 tribes, and then also the 12 disciples.
Yeah.
Yes, no, you're right.
Yes, and the 12 disciples correspond to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And the 4 fixed signs are the 4 evangelists. And the ancients knew this, and the church knows it. It's in their literature. I'm not just making this up.
Right. Okay, so now we've got this nice little survey on Gnosticism, the Gnostic Gospels, and it's nicely self-contained and captures everything. So I'm going to let it rip here.
What we're talking about tonight is the Gnostics, and specifically a bunch of Gnostic writings, Gnostic Gospels that had been lost. And so these are parts of the kind of large corpus of ancient Judeo-Christian, now Christian writing that is deemed by the early church to be heretical, and so therefore did not make it into the Christian New Testament, and largely because all ancient texts, in order for them to make it to us normally, had to go through medieval monks and nuns actually copying them by hand. And so essentially, if the monks liked somebody like Pliny or Cicero, then Cicero got all his works all copied. And if it was somebody, like, I don't know, anyway, somebody they didn't like as much, then that didn't make it. And so if you're a heretic, it especially usually didn't work. In a lot of cases, the text might actually have gotten erased, or in some circumstances even, destroyed in some other kind of way. But then again, one of the things that always can happen is if you happen to be living in the Near East, especially good to live in Egypt, if you take all of your texts and writings and scrolls and you put them in a jar and you walk just away from well, how have all these good gods ended up with this terrible circumstance?
Sorry.
Why the good are afflicted.
Hold on.
By the time of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. In the course of and a bunch of monks did that, and so that we ended up now finding in the middle of the 20th century all of these lost Gnostic Gospels. They've all been translated, and so now we can actually have been able to access them for the last half century. Okay, so traditionally, the traditional way that the Christian story is told by the Christians, right, history is told by the victors, and so the Christians who won tell the story that there was a guy named Jesus Christ who founded a church. And he lived, let's say, in the 30s of AD in Galilee and Judea. He claimed to be a Messiah, or the Messiah, which is to say in Greek, the Christ, the anointed one. He founded a church, commissioned all these apostles to go around and spread the good news, which is the English for the word gospel. That's what gospel means. He, in the course of those gospels, predicted his own death and resurrection. He's executed by the Romans, returns from the grave. He appears to the female disciples and then to the male disciples. Those apostles then spread the gospel first to other Jews. So all of those initial disciples are all Jews. They spread that news to other Jews. Afterward, they begin to convert Gentiles, as Jews called the Greek-speaking pagans that are the majority of people in the Eastern Roman Empire.
All of those initial apostles meet martyrs' deaths like Jesus, so they're also all executed in various kinds of ways in order to seal their testimony. Meanwhile, the apostles have all founded individual congregations or churches in different towns and cities, and according to the tradition here, then, as the traditional way of telling it, they've appointed overseers or bishops of those churches, and so that takes us to essentially the line then of bishops, or what's called the apostolic succession. So apostles appoint bishops, who appoint bishops, and so forth, all the way down to this day. And so this is definitely the narrative as it was understood and promoted by the bishops. As you can imagine, this is a very pro-bishop message, who led then the mainstream Christian churches by the time of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So the narrative explained why bishops were in charge on the one hand, and then justified their authority by apostolic succession back to Jesus as far as the bishops are concerned. Some people would occasionally wonder what happened to all these apostles. Why don't we have apostles anymore? The bishops. Reality is the bishops got rid of them, and so because apostles actually ended up being a very disruptive element after a certain amount of time. So the idea of an apostle is a person who is not any one particular place leading a community, but rather people who are going in twos all around anywhere, wherever they're led by the Spirit, and speaking by the Spirit, speaking different kinds of revelation, often chastising, let's say, congregations for what they're not doing, chastising bishops for their behavior or the way they're operating things, and at a certain amount of time, the bishops are not having any more of it, and they more or less think for all of these spiritual people, isn't there something else you guys would rather be doing than going around and this kind of traveling and begging and this kind of thing for your meals? Why can't we have this wonderful monastery here? And wouldn't you all like to go and live in there and maybe even take a vow of silence? And that might be a great idea for all of you. And so anyway, that's more or less functionally what happens. So for the bishops then, the narrative of the church's foundation is that there was this mainline Christian church led by bishops, which has brought us to, so what in antiquity was the one Catholic and Orthodox church, so before all of the church splits apart into the various denominations today. And in the meantime, from that perspective, from the perspective of those proto-Orthodox leaders who become then the Orthodox Catholic leaders, all of the other people that have different views are simply heretics. And they're heretics who are breakoffs, as far as they're concerned, from the church as it was. So the breakoffs include people like the Ebionites, the Marcionites, and the Gnostics, who we're going to talk about tonight. However, as we talked about in previous lectures here, the simple narrative written retrospectively from the perspective of the group that won, it's really, not the way, it doesn't really go that way. Actually, the story as it really was is much, much more complicated than the story as the bishops retold it and what happened. And so actually, what we can look back to when we are in the 1st century, and then when we can see more, we have way more evidence for by the time we get to the early 2nd century, there's not simply one church at all, and rather there are multiple Christianities that have different ways of understanding what the religion is supposed to be about. And these ways are vastly different from each other. They are at odds with each other, and in fact, the people often hate each other more than they hate anybody else, because you almost always hate the person who's closest to you than let's say a completely alien person. So they only can spend so much time being mad at pagans because there's these heretics right next to them that they don't like, right? So before the Emperor Constantine, before the conversion of the head of the Roman imperial state, there isn't one single Christian church structure or centralized authority. Constantine actually brings that together by creating the institution of the church council, the ecumenical council. So which is to say, ecumene is this Greek word for the whole world, and so it's a council that brings together all the bishops of the whole world, and the ecumenical council creates a creed that is able to explain what all Christians are supposed to believe, and so that puts everybody on the same page for the first time, and the council creates for the first time an actual hierarchical structure. So in addition to bishops now there are bishops above bishops, which are called metropolitan bishops, or in English you have archbishops, and so now suddenly there is a hierarchy. So it's changed. But back before Constantine then, there are multiple competing Christianities. The proto-Orthodox group, we call them, these are the guys before they win, in which case once they win, then they are the Orthodox or Catholic group, which is to say Orthodox means people who have the right teaching. And so nowadays we use Orthodox to refer to the Eastern Church, and we use Catholic to refer to the Western Church, but it's one church, until the breakup in the Middle Ages. And so I'm just going to interchangeably say Orthodox or Catholic, or before they win, proto-Orthodox, which is to say the people who the Orthodox people's foundation is built on, but before they are the winners, right? So they ultimately win, but there's no reason actually to believe that they're even the earliest group among these groups. So what do the Orthodox look like? So these proto-Orthodox guys, they have already this very complicated Christology that we've talked about a bunch in our different lectures, and complained about how complicated it is to try to explain the doctrine of the Trinity, and how, not only all the people here who are let's say Muslim and Jewish who are trying to wrestle with it. Generally speaking, all the Christians who come here and every time I more or less defy almost any Christian to talk about it for, let's say, more than 7 minutes without accidentally saying something that's heresy. And so you pretty much at a certain point you're going to suddenly make an analogy which is modalism, or you're going to make an analogy which unfortunately is like essentially Arianism, and so you're going to get into trouble if you don't just keep saying the same thing over and again, which is the creed. And so if you have to say new words for 7 minutes, I defy you not to say heresy. But anyway, it's very tough. So they have this idea. There's a complex Christology. Jesus is understood to be fully human, fully divine.
There's this very complex theology. The Father, Jesus, the Spirit are God. Jesus is not the Father or the Spirit. The Father is not the Spirit. The Father is not Jesus. All that. So it's that's complicated and very starkly monotheist. And so there is not a dualist or duotheist in the sense that Satan is not some kind of an alternate God. Satan is clearly an inferior being who is a creation, and God is in rebellion against God. So it's different in that sense. There's only one God, which is even if God has three persons. So very complicated. Okay. About these other groups, though, so the Ebionites, for example. So Ebionites are, sometimes we can say, the Jewish Christians. These are the Christians, anyway, who had, let's say, been converted. I mean, the original followers, Jesus and his original followers, are all Jewish. But these are especially groups that continue to convert primarily among Jewish, other non-Christian Jews, and then continue to live essentially as Jews who are also Christians. In other words, Jews who believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and they, though, still believe, for example, that it's essential to practice the law of Moses. And so are also therefore keeping kosher and all this kind of thing. There is a whole bunch of things, even in the canonical Gospels, there are precepts that continue to, that can be used in favor of essentially Ebionite interpretation of how Christians should act. So for example, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says things like, I'm not coming to, yeah, we'll have to get the microphone to you, 1 second. I'm not coming to eliminate the law, but to fulfill the law. Not one jot or one tittle of the law is put away. All is still in force. And so essentially, the community that the Gospel of Matthew is written in is definitely in favor of practicing Jewish law. So yes, I'm saying. You do because of the people online need to hear you.
I was just wondering, can you clarify what year this was for each of the, and in this case, the Ebionites?
So, so the Ebionites, so most of our information for any of these groups is coming from the 2nd century. We have AD, everything's AD, yeah, because it's all after Christ. These are Christians. And so the Ebionites will possibly date all the way back to Jesus' lifetime. So we don't know, but because we just don't have any data that is helping us out. There's very little Christian writings outside of the New Testament that are from the 1st century. And so we have to kind of piece it together. By the time the groups have emerged and are yelling at each other, it's the 2nd century and the 3rd century. And so it's just to say the 100s and the 200s. And so it's still before Christianity becomes a state religion, but it's this time period where we now have a little bit more of a window into what's going on. And we have to kind of then unpack it. And so I would believe that the Ebionites go back to the 1st century. And I also believe that the Proto-Orthodox go back to the 1st century. Same thing with these other two groups. So they all go back to the 1st century, but they're all still very active in the 2nd century. Joe.
Just want to know, are there any Ebionites today that date back to that time? Like,
so no, the Ebionites have died out. There are definitely revivals. So the idea is you may have heard of like Jews for Jesus or Messianic Jews or any number of modern Jewish, either Jewish groups that have become, let's say, Christian in the sense of thinking of Jesus as the Messiah or deciding that for themselves, or Christians who have decided to Judaize because they believe that the law is important. So that's still a theme that continually recurs, and so people will, in both of those different directions, even sometimes come together. So it may be Judaizing Christians and Messianic Jews, and they get together and make a church or synagogue of Jews for Jesus or whatever it would be, but they don't have any continuity with the Ebionites. The Ebionites died out, and we don't have many of their writings here. Yes. It's actually late. So they had died out in the Roman Empire by, let's say, the 600s or 700s. They might have continued to live in, for example, the Arab Middle East and influenced Islam well into the Muslim period.
I met some Jews for Jesus back in the 70s who believed in all the Jewish.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So we have had, we did a lecture, it was a year ago now, on Jesus's Jewish roots, and we actually had the rabbi who came here is from I believe I was given to understand anyway, for what he was telling me, is from a Messianic Jewish synagogue / church. And so a lot of his followers, he, as from I could tell, is from regular Jewish background, but had decided that Jesus is the Messiah. And so anyway, was quite informed about Jewish custom law and everything like that. Whereas like a lot of his, so he had like four people from his synagogue who all were from Christian background, who had now studied Torah and everything like that because they had become essentially Judaizing Christians. You know what I mean? So it's an interesting crossover, and I think it's really neat. But anyway, it's not. Unfortunately, we don't have the continuity, and we also don't have that for the Gnostics. We'll see, as we'll see. So the ancient proto-Orthodox Christians, when they became Orthodox, it turns out they ended up being pretty good at stamping out these other groups. And so we don't have continuity, but in a lot of cases, we have these are ideas that continue to inspire people, and so there are new Gnostics, in the 21st century. Okay. So Ebionites. So in addition to this, anyway, like we were mentioning, these are Christians who still follow Jewish law, or Jews who essentially believe that the Messiah is Jesus, and so they're that crossover. They have their own gospel, which is sometimes called the Gospel of the Hebrews or the Gospel of the Ebionites. We don't have it; it's lost. So we only have some quotations from proto-Orthodox people who believe these guys were heretics. They indicate that they think it's related to the Gospel of Matthew. We don't really know because we can't tell. Anyway, we don't have it, sadly. This group, Ebionites, may have grown out of the group that's called the poor, or the poor of Jerusalem. So Ebionim, or Eboim, that kind of thing, is essentially the Ebionite. In other words, the word Ebionite may come from the Hebrew word for poor. And Paul, when he's talking about the church in Jerusalem that is being led in Paul's day by James, the brother of Jesus, he calls that group the poor of Jerusalem. And so all through Paul's letters, and then also the letters of James and the related letters, Jude and Peter, they talk about the poor and they talk about the rich. And so the people in the poor church, the Ebionites, possibly the Proto-Ebionites, they call themselves the poor. And they also, if you think of like the thing of Jesus saying, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom. So the kingdom of this church belongs to the poor. And woe unto you rich, essentially all of these Gentile converts who have in the cities of the Greek-speaking world who have joined up and become part of Paul's church. Woe unto you rich, because you aren't, the true Christians as far as the poor of Jerusalem are concerned. So it's possible that that's where this group comes from. We don't know. So one of the ideas we had when we had a lecture on Lost Christianities, as opposed to that timeline that I gave before, where the bishops more or less say that the Orthodox, Proto-Orthodox was founded directly by Jesus and they are the inheritors of that, I'm suggesting that one way these are possible, this isn't for sure, so is that this poor followers of John the Baptist and Jesus and his brother James, this Jacobus or Jamesian church, becomes the Ebionites, so this poor of Jerusalem, whereas the church that Paul founds among the Gentiles, so among the Greek-speaking people who had been pagans but now have become Christian but without having to follow the Jewish law. So the Paulist church then possibly is what merges and becomes the Proto-Orthodox, the Orthodox and Catholic Church, and out of which further ideas, the Marcionites and the Gnostics emerge out of that Paul church and diverge even further away from Judaism. So by the time we're getting to the Gnostics, in some sense, we've left a lot of the Jewish roots of this religion behind, and it has become way more, especially Platonist. But we'll see that. Okay, so those are those first two, the Proto-Orthodox and the Ebionites. Now we'll talk about the Marcionites. So these are a group that is founded by a guy called Marcion, and of Marcion's work, these are kind of dualist Hellenistic Christians. They're essentially, like I say, these Greek-speaking ones that have very little connection to Judaism. For them, Paul is the chief of the apostles and the chief source on Christianity, and they got rid of everything else except for their scripture is essentially just some of Paul's letters and just the Gospel of Luke, and actually even just an edited version of that. So that's for them, that's the idea, and really Paul is the basis for that. They have a different overall theology, which is dualist, which is to say they believe that there is good and evil that are two very balanced powers, as opposed to what we were talking about in monotheism, where God is simply good and evil is absence of good, or evil is in rebellion from good. In this case, there's a good God and an evil God that are in a cosmic battle. And the Old Testament God specifically, as far as Marcion is concerned, is in fact that evil God. And so the evil God that occurs in the Old Testament that tries to destroy everybody with the blood and all this kind of thing, and does all kinds of, gets wrathful and this sort of thing, that's the evil God. And the good God is the true God of spirit, who is Jesus's Father, the God of the spirit world.
Were the Marcionites the first or the early ones to propose Christ's sacrifice as a redemption? In a sense, like, because there's the whole line of God having to send his only son as a sacrifice. And I heard somewhere that, and I don't know if it was the Marcionite that we talked about, but it was a similar kind of ideology. And that they were the ones that proposed this idea of, Jesus having to come as a sacrifice because the good God had to send his son as a sacrifice, so the old God would just let things go.
So for all the early Christians, they all come up with very different ideas about why Jesus had to die. And so that's, like you say, one of the ideas, and it isn't, by the way, it's not even necessarily doctrine to this day, because in fact there are multiple different reasons why the atonement is necessary. So in fact, it's not like there's just one theory for atonement theory. In terms of this being, I get your reasoning, which is to say this makes a lot more sense, because this idea of a ransom theory. So ransom theory is this idea that since the devil is owed something, for why, I don't, like you say, it's not necessarily clear why, but in this case where you actually have the devil as an actual God that is, more or less is just as powerful as the good God, then that's, then that kind of makes more sense than why do you have to ransom to a lesser power? God is omnipotent, that doesn't need to do that, you think, right? And so in that sense, it seems like it would make more sense. But in fact, the Marcionites and the Gnostics don't even think that the crucifixion ever really even happened. Because they have gone to a place where the true Jesus is just entirely a God and is entirely a being of spirit. And so in that sense, the crucifixion is itself just a trick. And so probably not, but it would make, in some sense, make more sense for them. But in fact, early Christians are all very divided over this. And in fact, this division remains. People still have different views about why that would have occurred. Okay, so for these guys, for Marcion, So there's alternate answers for these non-proto-Orthodox Christians. So this is not what ended up happening in Christianity, but some of these early Christians, like Marcion, read the Hebrew Bible and they felt they couldn't reconcile the literary actions of the God of Israel with their own understanding of ethical behavior. So, I mean, we had here, for example, the flood, right? And so this idea that God decides he's going to destroy all of creation except for Noah and the people and the animals that they make it on the ark. Many then determined that if Christ is truly divine, he must have just appeared to be human. And they probably had been influenced then by the dualism that occurred, or that was also going on in the Zoroastrian religion, so the primary religion of Persia that had been incredibly important in the Middle East and still continued to be even in the Roman period, or also from Platonism. So Plato, who also has a very strong dualism, and his philosophy continues to be resonating at this point in anyway, all the way much longer than this. So what are these two different kinds of dualism? So in Zoroastrianism, we have this thing that we've just been talking about, that the cosmos is governed by two competing principles. So these are Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, and Angramanyu, the destructive principle. And so for Zoroastrians, the prophet of this religion, this answers this problem of evil, because a lot of times we wonder, well, why do the righteous suffer? If you have been good, you've been following God, you've been doing everything, and God is good, why is it that you get punished with cancer? Why is it that some horrible villain, why does he make $1 billion and not get cancer? Whereas this wonderful, widow has to suffer for all these different ideas. And the answer then for dualists of this variety is, well, Angramanyu here is actually actively thwarting what God would want to do, because there is this cosmic battle going on between good and evil, which is why the good are afflicted, right? And so that's one way of having a dualism. The other kind of dualism that we have is like Plato's kind of dualism that we talk about, which is the separation of the world into the ideal, which is to say the immaterial, so the eternal forms, things like justice, things like love, things like math, things that are perfect and eternal and not perishable, and then everything else, all this material stuff that is mortal, that's going to die, that's continuously corrupting and corrupted. And so in this kind of dualism, the reason why suffering happens is that this whole physical world that we see that seems to be where you're getting sick and all these other things, that's all nonsense, meaningless ultimately anyway, because your true eternal self is the immaterial soul or spark of divine light that's inside of you that will ultimately be liberated from this mortal coil that is all about suffering and perishability and everything like that. And so those are two different dualisms. Both of those dualisms actually affect Christianity in ways that Christians often have a very muddy idea about which one it is. So for example, people often think of themselves as having this immaterial soul, or that's like a ghost and things like that. And so then when you die, it's kind of liberated, and so that's kind of you go to heaven, and heaven's this wonderful spiritual place, and all the dogs are down there, and everything like that. And so when you have that in a way, that in a sense, that's the kind of Greek spiritual spirit heaven. But then you also have the Persian, everybody's going to get bodily resurrected in the kind of post-Armageddon afterlife, when the world is renewed and the evil principle is finally defeated. And so you also have done that one. And so both of those kind of get merged together into Christian theology, Abrahamic theology. Okay, so we've been talking about Marcion. So Marcion is the founder of this, called Marcionites because he's the leader of it, and the proto-Orthodox didn't like him, and so they called it a heresy. And so anyway, they called it Marcionites. So Marcion, as I mentioned then, wanted to take Christianity all Paul. He didn't, the Old Testament was talking about essentially communication at best the prophets are having with the evil God. And then all of the rest of the scriptures of the New Testament is often written by Paul's detractors, and he just wanted to cut all of those out so those wouldn't be used in Christian worship. Right, those questions here.
Just quickly, since we've already moved into the Gospel of Luke, etc., who would you say purported the idea mainly that in regard to dualism and good versus evil, Satan runs the earth, and that was usually that's in Genesis. That was, I understand the general, thesis of the whole piece.
Yeah, so the idea, so who has the idea that Satan's running the earth? So Satan is in fact.
Exactly.
So I'll just mention Satan is not actually in Genesis.
No, it's
so
Lucifer.
No,
the snake.
The snake, just the serpent. And so the serpent is later interpreted by this time by Christians to be Satan. But when the text of that part of Genesis is written, the ancient Hebrews don't have an idea of Satan yet. And so that is not what's meant. It's really just a serpent in the original story. So back in Old Testament times, this idea of Satan and the devil and all these things just hardly exists. So there's in almost all of the oldest part of the Old Testament, that character doesn't recur. So if you think of even Genesis, the serpent, if the serpent actually was Satan, you'd think he'd show up in the very next chapter when he's inspiring, let's say, Cain to kill Abel. That happens totally without Cain talking to the devil or anything like that. And so anyway, but by the time it has come around to Jesus's time, this has been heavily brought into Judaism, probably because of the Jews were part of the Persian Empire for several centuries. And so probably as a result of Zoroastrian influence, this idea of an evil cosmic force is imported into Judaism, and it's there as of the time period of Jesus, Second Temple Judaism. But it is open for debate.
So, for example, different Jewish sects, some of them are very much believers in Satan and the cosmic battle and things like that. So, for example, the people who are writing the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes, those guys are pretty excited about like cosmic evil, and they're very excited about a Messiah and an apocalypse and all that kind of thing. Whereas the people that are in charge of the temple at the time, the Sadducees do not believe in any of that stuff. They think that all of that is not in the oldest part of the Bible, and so the people have added new things, and they reject all of that. And they also, for example, reject the idea of afterlife at all, because that's not in the oldest part of the Bible. So there was a big diversity of beliefs at that time. So in terms of this, though, Christians are pulling out largely out of the Judaism that is apocalyptic and that does believe that there is a devil that is a tempter. And that's certainly mentioned, like you say, in Luke's gospel. So what becomes the four canonical gospels do have the figure of the devil in them, but it isn't clear how powerful the devil is, right? So it will allow for the early Christians to then debate amongst themselves how powerful this figure is. And so for the Marcionites, for the Gnostics, this becomes a much more important, powerful cosmic devil. For the Proto-Orthodox, he's essentially a rebel angel, and he might have gotten knocked out of the story entirely for the Ebionites. So depending on where we're at. Okay, so just looking at this then, Marcion then, like I said, rejects the Old Testament because he believes that the God of the Hebrew Bible was a different evil entity, and then he created actually his own rival church structure, and it becomes actually quite successful and popular in what's now Turkey, so Anatolia. And so he is for a while a pretty serious competitor to the Proto-Orthodox. So then lastly, then we get to these guys, the Gnostics, who are actually the topic for tonight. So like Marcion, they're dualists generally, but unlike him, they also then create a very elaborate mythology. And so they have an amazingly complicated cosmology. They create essentially new stories that explain essentially their philosophy or their theology in the form of a very long kind of expansions of the Genesis story of creation. So the Gnostics believed that they alone possessed the true secret gnosis or knowledge, and they rejected the idea that Jesus was human at all, and actually they also believed that human bodies, so everything physical, is itself evil. So the evil God created the whole physical world, and the evil God has captured true spirits, the divine sparks that are in true individuals. Not everybody's got one even, but whatever the true sparks are, they're imprisoned essentially in these physical bodies. And the mission of Jesus actually is to open that pathway for those sparks to get back to the real universe, the universe of spirit. Okay, so one of the very first guys in this, who was a leader of the Gnostics, is a guy called Valentinus. He's from Egypt, which should come as no shock to everybody. The Egyptians like this kind of stuff, and so a lot of times esoteric things comes out of Egypt. So he is in the 2nd century. He may well, at least he traditionally claims to be a disciple of a guy called Theudas, who was in turn then one of Paul's disciples. So he claims a fairly close lineage to Paul. He may have been influenced by Christian philosophers and also by pagan philosophers, so people who are Neoplatonists, Middle Platonists. They're teaching at the schools in Alexandria. So Alexandria is still the center of Hellenistic thought. So this is where the museum is. This is where the library is. The museum is the school of all the muses, right, where they're teaching philosophy. He had a number then of disciples, and he became really serious enemies with Proto-Orthodox leaders of the time, so Tertullian and Irenaeus, who wrote treatises against his teachings. So essentially then, if we look at the way that structure of those groups work, we essentially have the Ebionites, the Marcionites, and the Proto-Orthodox. They each have their own kind of church structures. They have their own leaders. They'll have their own bishops in their own kind of areas. They both have, the Orthodox are sort of in the middle in terms of their Christology. So the Ebionites are going to have held more to the whole Jewishness and probably reject any divinity for Jesus, and instead are focused on God as God only, and so they're probably more in that kind of direction. The Marcionites have kind of left the Jewishness really behind and are now sort of Platonists almost, and so the Proto-Orthodox are kind of in between those two. The Gnostics, however, don't have their own structure in their own churches usually, but rather they are little groups that occur inside the other Christian churches, especially the Proto-Orthodox Church. And so what will especially happen is you might have a little group of people inside your big congregation in a big city who are meeting then separately. It's like you have your own Bible study course on a Wednesday or something. And when they all go over to the other person's house, that person who has been initiated into the gnosis is able to share then these secret teachings with this kind of elite inner circle. And those are the guys who really know what Christianity is all about. And whereas the rest of the church are just meant to be kept in darkness because it's not given to them to know the secrets of eternal life and everything. Jean?
So if the Gnostics were just members of these different churches, wouldn't their own teachings be sort of modified versions of the teachings within the churches they were in, as opposed to just having their own set of teachings?
So they're secret teachings. so there would have been their own thinkers and things like that. In some cases, there are important leaders like Valentinus who wanted to become a bishop of the church and things like that. But I'm just suggesting that it's more complicated for the Proto-Orthodox people to root these guys out, because they can't just point to them and say, oh, there's a Gnostic church over there like the Marcionites. Instead, oh look, there are Gnostics in my church. Is what they would kind of happen, because again, it's like spread through sort of a secret way. So we already have, back in New Testament times, what's possibly a warning that Proto-Orthodox writers have against the Gnostics, and it's included in the Epistle of 2 Timothy, which is a disciple of Paul who's writing, pretending that it's Paul who's writing, and is probably warning leaders about other leaders who are Proto-Gnostic. So he writes, avoid empty and worldly chatter. Those who indulge in it will stray further and further into godless courses, and the infection of their teaching will spread like gangrene. Such are Hymenaeus and Philetus, they have shot wide of the truth, saying our resurrection has already taken place, and they're upsetting people's faith. And so essentially they are teaching, we don't know anything more than this, but what they're saying is they're teaching let's say a much more spiritual resurrection. So the people in, the guy who's writing here is Paul in the letter to Timothy's church. He's believing, let's say, in a literal eschatology, there's going to be an end time where there's going to be a very physical bodily resurrection, maybe. And now instead he is confronting these kind of leaders within his own church who are saying, no, all this resurrection talk is entirely spiritualized. It's already occurred. And guess what? We have a lot of other gnosis that we can explain to you about how the actual salvation works and what's the true Christian gospel. And so essentially this is happening probably already then in the first century. Okay, so we talked around a lot about it. So what is Gnosticism in general? So the word comes from the Greek gnosis, meaning knowledge. And the Gnostics, salvation comes through learning the secret esoteric knowledge that allows you to mystically participate with the divine. So it's a very particular, it's not just that knowledge is good, it's a very particular kind of esoteric secret knowledge. There have been yes. I don't know. So I don't, and unfortunately I'm not a Greek speaker, and so I haven't looked it up. So the question is, what's the Greek word for Gnostic? And I don't know. I'd have to say, I could say like Gnostikoi or something, but I don't really know what the Greek would be. We'd have to look it up. Sorry. Okay, the word has been applied to a whole bunch of different groups, and so they don't all have continuity with each other. So even though lots of groups are called Gnostic because of a general belief they might have, those could be even, let's say, non-Christian Jewish groups from antiquity to medieval groups like the Cathars and the Bogomils to modern people today, New Age people who are Gnostic but have no continuity with ancient Gnostics. So anyway, they don't form a single continuous group. Today, the one traditional organized group of Gnostics that have survived from antiquity down are the Mandaeans. And this is a group of Mandaeans, I think, in either northern Iraq or in Iran, who are, in some sense, look back to John the Baptist as one of the leaders of their religion and continue to practice things like baptism. And they also have essentially a theology that's Gnostic and possibly goes all the way back to the Gnostics. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of neo-Gnostics now in the 21st century, people part of the New Age, people who, when the Gnostic texts came forward, this was just a thing that people found really cool, and they decided they were Gnostics.
There's a lovely book by Gerard Russell. I can't remember the title, but it's about lost religions or minority religions or something of the Middle East. The Mandaeans are in there.
Yeah.
All sorts of others, including the people who have come to live in Dearborn, not Ohio.
Dearborn, Michigan. Yeah.
Dearborn, Michigan.
Chaldeans.
He says, yeah, the Chaldees or Chaldees, says you can go into a supermarket there and hear Aramaic.
Yeah, it's neat. Yeah, and so we lived in Michigan for a while and knew some people who are Chaldean. So they're, unfortunately, these guys have been in the middle of all of the fighting the last little while, and so have been attacked by ISIS and stuff like that.
Sorry, I'm promise I'm trying to take advantage of holding the mic. With the submersion and the whole baptism, I don't know whether it's just the setting with the river, but it reminds me so strongly of when people go to the Ganges and immerse themselves in the Ganges in order to cleanse themselves of their sins. And I'm wondering if this is just something that emerged independently, because I know some people have argued for Jesus having some kind of Eastern teachings or having come across such things.
So I don't know the origin of that particular practice, and so it's interesting. There are early connections, but it also is. It wouldn't be Jesus going anywhere, but so Jesus is a disciple of John the Baptist. John the Baptist is known for this as a spiritual practice. This spiritual practice existed already in Judaism, so ritual bathing for ritual purity, but it changed under John the Baptist's practice into something new, which is whereas opposed to a ritual purity that is only good until you become ritually impure again, this was a baptism of like essentially entering into a new spiritual realm or something like that of of cleansing of sin permanently kind of thing. And so anyways, so the immediate source for this particular ritual in Christianity and probably Mandaeism is Jewish ritual bathing. But in any event, ritual bathing goes all the way back in paganism too, and so it's probably just they all have that same idea as going back for cleanliness. Okay, I'm just going to mention then, just to recap. So we just talked about how there's these possibly Buddhist ideas and other kinds of things that are in India, that are through Persia, that are maybe also influencing the Zoroastrians or maybe influencing Jews and Christians. Same thing, Platonism is also introduced, is Jews that are Hellenized, it's also affected them. So it all kind of comes together. There's Gnostic ideas anyway that are running all around it. So they're drawing from a wide variety of sources to get to Christian Gnosticism. All the way up until very recently, all of our knowledge from Gnosticism about Gnostics came from the Proto-Orthodox. So essentially the people who won, and they wrote big long tracts against Valentinus, against the Gnostics as heretics. And so they wrote all the different things about why they thought Gnostics were bad. Irenaeus, for example, has things quite confused. So he accused Gnostics of debauchery and hedonism based on their dismissal of the material world. So essentially, because nothing in the material world matters, he used to more or less accuse them of not caring about marriage in this life, and so that therefore they could have orgies or all kinds of things that you accuse your enemies of. In point of fact, the Gnostics were probably the opposite, like we say, where they believed that all sex is bad. So they would have been maybe, if anything, more Puritan than the proto-Orthodox in the sense of sex. Okay, so we mentioned then that changed in the middle of the 20th century when a bunch of codices, which is to say little books that are buried in the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, were found right after World War II near an ancient Orthodox monastery. And so ultimately that collection was assembled and went to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. So there are 12 little books plus 8 leaves of the 13th book. And all of these contain a bunch of different tracts. And so when you take them all out together, there's 52 tractates. So there's 52 different little books that are inside these kind of bound together in books. They're all written in Coptic, which is Egyptian, but it's the Egyptian language that is written using the Greek alphabet. So after the Egyptians have stopped writing as much in the hieroglyphs or in the Demotic, the hieratic and Demotic, so which is to say the abbreviated and simpler versions of the hieroglyphics. They've been ruled by the Ptolemies, for 3 centuries prior to essentially the Romans killing Cleopatra, and ending the dynasty and it becoming a Roman province directly. And so in that amount of time, Cleopatra, even though she's, we think of her as the Queen of Egypt, everything like that, she's full on a Macedonian, she's a Greek, and so is all her, all of her dynasty. And so in that amount of time, there has been a lot of Greek influence in her capital, which is Alexandria, founded by Alexander, and it's the center of Greek thought, right? And so anyway, so Egyptian has been being written, it's still the Egyptian language, and so it's related much more distantly, but it's distantly related to Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic, but it's a different language family. It used to be called the Hamitic family, it's now called the what is it called? Well, yeah, so it used to be Hamido-Semitic, and now it's called Afro-Asiatic. Anyway, so it's like that, and so but it's written now in Coptic here, which is to say the Greek alphabet, and it's still the language, the liturgical language of the Coptic Christian church. So there's still a large percentage of the Egyptian population. At a certain point, Egypt was a Christian nation. It was conquered by the Arabs. The everyday language became Arabic, and but anyway, Coptic continued to be old Egyptian language continued to be the liturgical language or church language of the Christian church. So the Coptic texts are all translations. The ones in Nag Hammadi, these ones that got dug up, they're all translations of Greek originals probably. And there are multiple translators. Some of these translators are good, some of these translators are not so good, apparently, and there's a bunch of different scribes from the different translators. So just looking at all these books that we have, it's a collection made by a person or a group of people that are interested in Gnosticism, but it's not that they're necessarily all Gnostic texts or they weren't originally all Gnostic texts. So for example, Codex 6 contains a very poor Coptic translation of Plato's Republic. However, that version of the Republic has now been also heavily modified so that it includes Gnostic ideas. So it's no longer a perfect translation or anything like that, or a word for word or a literal translation. It's actually an expansion of Plato in order to make Plato's work more Gnostic. Many of the texts then have been made Gnostic and Christian. So like, for example, the Republic is not originally a Christian text either, but here it's being modified. And so, for example, in Codex 5, there's a philosophical text called Eunostus the Blessed, and that is essentially a pagan text, philosopher text. But then Codex number 3 uses the same source text, so the same things that this guy Eunostus was saying, but now it's put into Christ's mouth, and it's divided up into questions. The disciples will ask a question, and Christ will answer, and now it's called the Sophia of Jesus Christ. But it's the same text, but now, and even the people in the library might have figured that out themselves. There's not that many books, anyway. But in any event, that's what ends up happening. So the same wisdom has now been repurposed as Jesus' wisdom. So other texts have gone through similar Gnostic redactions. So there might have been an early Christian source. For example, when we get to the Gospel of Thomas, there might have been a very early sayings gospel that has now been expanded with Gnostic additions. Okay, so I want to look at some of these gospels so we can actually get into it and see some of these. I just picked some modern Gnostic imagery because it always looks cool, the esoteric stuff, right? And so just to give you guys a feel for how esoteric all these texts are. So we've talked about Valentinus, who's one of these early Gnostic leaders. We only had what his detractors said about him. However, it's completely possible that one of the texts that's in the Nag Hammadi library, which is entitled The Gospel of Truth, is actually a text that's by Valentinus. So we knew of text that Irenaeus, who's a proto-Orthodox writer, condemned Valentinus for writing such a book. And so it may well be that we now have the book and we can actually look at it. And so I'm just going to read a little quote here from it that kind of shows the Christology, this Christological question from the Gospel of Truth. Now, the name of the Father is the Son. It is he who first gave a name to the one who came forth from him, who was himself, and he begot him a son. He gave him his name, which belonged to him. He is the one to whom belongs all that exists around him, the Father. His is the name, his is the Son. It is possible for him to be seen. The name, however, is invisible because it alone is the mystery of the invisible, which comes to the ears that are completely filled with it by him. For indeed, the Father's name is not spoken, but it is apparent through a Son. Since the Father is unengendered, he alone is the one who begot him for himself as a name. But before he brought forth the eons, in order that the name of the Father should be over the head as Lord, that is, the name in truth, which is firm in his command through perfect power. For the name is not from mere words, nor does his name consist of appellations, but it is invisible. He gave a name to him alone, since he alone sees him, he alone having the power to give him a name. For he who does not exist has no name. The name, therefore, is that of the Father, as the name of the Father is the Son. Yeah, exactly. No wonder Gnosticism was so popular when you like start spreading it around within the congregation, right? No. So we mentioned how complicated the Trinity is, right? And so what's going on here is in the Gospel of Truth is that apparently here, Valentinus maybe has had a way that he's trying to work out the Christology and make it so that you can understand what the whole point of it is and what the sense of it is. So the idea, maybe if we can kind of try to get through this and to figure it out, is that the God, the Creator God, is unknown, unseen, unseeable. You can't even say that God's name because that's not allowed in terms of the when we get to the 4 letters as they are written in the Hebrew Bible, you're not to say them, and so we're not even supposed to know, that we might pronounce those letters Yahweh or Jehovah or whatever it would be. We're not, it's not to be known or not to be said, and so and it's also unseeable. So the idea though is that God then, who's ungendered, also begot a son who is him and who is that God. In other words, that son is still God, and then in so doing has given a name to that God, which is Father and is also Son, which wouldn't otherwise be seen or known or knowable if it weren't for the fact of it occurring, right? So if we didn't have this Christological nightmare, we wouldn't have any way that we could describe God in positive terms. We would only have negative theology where we say God is infinite, invisible, all those kind of negative things, which is to say not bounded, not seen, all that sort of thing. So that's essentially, anyway, the idea then maybe that Valentinus has, but which also possibly isn't quite Trinitarian because it may well be more or less saying that the Father is the Son, but it depends. It kind of seems like he's saying that. If so, it's not Trinitarian. Okay, I want to define a couple Gnostic terms as we go forward. So one of them is the monad. And so when we were talking about the Father here a second ago, this is the one absolute God, the Creator, which is to say that they use the word the monad, right? And so the perfect aeon who rules over what they call the fullness, which is to say the pleroma, the region of light and life. Then there are aeons, which are emanations from the monad, who are universals, and they are generally paired, and they're such things as things like sloth and silence. And so these aeons then aren't that different in some sense from Platonic forms, of which the last of the aeons is Sophia, which is to say wisdom, the divine feminine form, wisdom. She gives birth to the demiurge, which is the flawed God of the Old Testament who creates the material world. The demiurge is also the name that Aristotle gives to the unmoved mover, the first cause, right? So the cause of the physical world. Then there are archons, who are the evil angels who serve the demiurge, and then gnosis, right, which we've already talked about. So that knowledge that brings the true eternal life. So overall, the kind of cosmology, the vision, the theology that the Gnostics have, although they don't all agree with each other, is the material world then is created by that flawed creator, the demiurge, whose work is a flawed simulacrum of the ideal reality, this kind of Platonic universe, the material universe. The true God is a source then of the ideal universe of light and spirit that we can't see, the unseeable. And this cosmic accident happens can be understood by learning then this very complicated mythology that is like essentially a allegory drama about how the different aeons were emanated from God in different order. So some humans contain this divine spark of light that can be returned to the divine realm through a process of enlightened awakening, and that's essentially what Gnosticism is about. So you experience enlightenment, you experience wisdom when you rehearse and learn all of this secret gnosis. And Jesus then is the Son of the one true God who sent in the material world in order to bring about salvation through enlightenment, as opposed to any other thing. So not ransom or any other way that might be understood. So next one of these texts in Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Mary. So specifically, this is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So there's a bunch of different Marys in the New Testament. The proto-Orthodox folks emphasize their authority through Peter, especially. So if you look now to Rome, Peter and Paul are all over everything, and the Pope has these keys because Christ gives Peter the keys in the Gospel of Matthew. Gnostics, by contrast, tend to denigrate Peter. So Peter ends up usually being kind of a jerk or a hothead or an idiot in Gnostic Gospels. And instead, the kind of good people in the Gnostic Gospels, or the authoritative ones, tend to be Mary Magdalene and also Thomas. So Thomas in the Orthodox Gospel is the guy who's the doubter, who doesn't believe Jesus was resurrected. He's the wiser disciple in the Gnostic Gospels. So we have fragments from Nag Hammadi of this Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And in this text, Jesus is said to love Mary more than the male apostles and to uphold her alone secret teachings, gnosis, which Peter doubts are true teachings. He doesn't believe that Mary actually got taught this. And so I'll just quote a little from then. We'll read a little bit of this text, the Gospel of Mary. So Jesus, answered and said to me, Mary Magdalene is the author of this, according to the text anyway, blessed are you that did not waver at the sight of me. For where the mind is, there is treasure. And there's a lot of emphasis on thinking and mind and that kind of thing in Gnosticism. Mary then goes on to describe her vision about how the soul can overcome the various powers of ignorance. And it's a big, long 4-stage process. And then there's multiple sub-stages and things like that. And so when the soul goes through all of that, according to this enlightenment through gnosis, the soul answers and said, says, so now it's gone through all of that enlightenment. What binds me has been slain. What surrounds me, all of this physical matter, in other words, has been overcome. My desire has been ended. So just like in Buddhism, you try to eliminate desire. Desire is the cause of suffering. And ignorance has died. So now we're focused on true knowledge as opposed to ignorant desire for material things. In a world, I was released from the fetter of oblivion, all of this material realm that is worthless, which is transient, right? So it's all going to dissolve away. From this time on, I will attain to the rest of time, of the season, of the aeon in silence. So now we've transcended this transient material realm. So when Mary had said this, she fell silent, since it was to this point that the Savior had spoken to her. But Andrew answered and said to the brethren, say what you wish to say about what she has said. I at least do not believe that the Savior said this. For certainly these teachings are strange ideas. So when Mary gives him this gnosis, Andrew jumps up and says, I don't believe it. This is strange stuff. Peter answered and spoke concerning the same things. He questioned about the Savior. Did he really speak to a woman? With a woman without our knowledge and not openly? Are we to turn around and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Mary wept and said to Peter, my brother Peter, what do you think? Do you think that I thought this of myself in my heart, or that I'm lying about the Savior? And so you can imagine, actually, that this is the kind of conversation that would occur in a regular proto-Orthodox church that you might be going to when a person who's a Gnostic kind of comes up to like you as a member who's never heard of all this stuff before. And so then you get told all of this Gnostic gospel stuff and the secret gnosis, and it's all so different from everything you've heard. These are strange ideas. And so it's worked out actually in this gospel, essentially an internal apologetic to how that person works through it. Oh, Peter and Andrew both kind of felt that same kind of way, but it ultimately works out that we should be listening to Mary because Mary did not just make this up, but this is the true teachings according to this gospel. Next, so another one of the books that we have in these lost gospels is called the Apocryphon of John. So this is a 2nd century Gnostic text that claims to be a secret book of John, the son of Zebedee, as told to him by Jesus, and it contains an elaborate mythology that explains the Gnostic creation story and the understanding and organization and purpose of creation. So there's plenty of these different Gnostic creations, and this is just going to be one of the examples that we'll look at. So quoting from that book, I, John, asked to know it, and he, Jesus, said to me, the monad, so remember that kind of Gnostic term, is a monarchy with nothing above it. It is he who exists as God and Father of everything, the invisible one who is above everything, who exists as incorruption, which is in the pure light into which no eye can look. So again, this is the same kind of idea, this Platonic immaterial idea, invisible and also incorruptible, right? So the world of the forms is perfect. It's not like the material world that corrupts. He is the invisible spirit of whom it is not right to think of him as a God or something similar, for he is more than a God, for he does not exist in something inferior to him, since everything exists in him, for it is he who establishes himself. He's the unmoved mover. He is eternal, since it does not need anything. He's the first cause. He is therefore total perfection, is the idea here in the cosmology or theology that's in the Gnostic gospel here of John. And the monad's thought, performed a deed, and she came forth from his mind. She is the forethought of all. Her light shines like his light. The perfect power, which is the image of the invisible virginal spirit, who is perfect. The first power, the glory of Barbello, the perfect glory in the aeons. And so then after that aeon, Barbello, then there comes forth a pentad of paired aeons, forethought, Barbello, thought, indestructibility, eternal life, truth. Then comes the word of creation, which is Christ. Then the autogenes come forth. So in other words, it's this unending stream, and this is a very long explanation of how creation works in terms of sort of philosophical underpinnings, but it's become more of a mythological story narrative. And then finally, the last then of these aeons, Sophia. So the Sophia of the Epinoia, being an aeon, conceived a thought for herself. She wanted to bring forth a likeness out of herself without the consent of the spirit he had not approved, and without her consort. So even though she's wisdom, at the end of all of these emanations, these spiritual emanations, Sophia, the last aeon, decides that she's going to try creation, her own hand at creation, and that causes the catastrophe, right? So the result is the creation of a flawed but powerful God, which is named Yaltabaoth, which is essentially the idea of the Yahweh or Jehovah of the Bible, the Old Testament. Yaltabaoth then goes on to enact Genesis, so the physical world's creation, and is the source, the demiurge that creates the physical world. Then special roles are given to Adam, Eve, their son Seth, Noah's wife, Nerea, which is not actually named in the Old Testament, and it ends then with the Savior explaining his role to John. So it's a long, elaborate retelling, essentially, of the Judeo-Christian story now through Gnostic cosmology. Another one of these that has another one of those kind of stories is called On the Origin of the World. And so it's another elaborate Gnostic creation myth and cosmology. It's different, so we might as well just see the range of these. The author then mixes Jewish, Manichaean, Christian, Greek philosophical, and mythological ideas with the magic and astrology. And so it reworks Genesis, giving Eve a much more exalted role, which is interesting. So this is just a little excerpt from On the Origin of the World. And when they had finished Adam, he abandoned him as an inanimate vessel, since he had taken form like an abortion, in that no spirit was in him. Regarding this thing, when the chief ruler remembered the saying of Pistis, which is to say his mother wisdom, he was less afraid lest the true man, the Adam of light, enter his modeled form and become its lord. For this reason, he left his modeled form 40 days without a soul, and he withdrew and he abandoned it. Now, on the 40th day, Sophia Zoe sent her breath into Adam, who had no soul. He began to move upon the ground, and he could not stand up. When the 7 rulers came, they saw him and were greatly disturbed. And when they saw that Adam could not stand up, they were glad, and they took pity on him and put him in paradise, and they withdrew up to their heavens. And after the day of rest, Sophia sent her daughter Zoe, being called Eve, as an instructor in order that she might make Adam, who had no soul, arise, so that those whom he could engender might become containers of light. When Eve saw her male counterpart prostrate, she had pity upon him, and she said, Adam, become alive, arise upon the earth. Immediately her word became accomplished fact, for Adam, having arisen, suddenly opened his eyes. When he saw her, he said, you shall be called mother of the living, for it is you who have given me life. So it's quite a different retelling anyway of Adam and Eve's story. But you can also see this idea that, that it has to also explain this complicated reason why true souls or light spirit sparks or whatever are trapped inside these mortal prisons of our bodies that we shouldn't actually, that has been the cause of all this problem. Well, how have all these good gods ended up with this terrible circumstance of the world as we now have it? The Gnostics, have explained through elaborate cosmology why that has happened. When we're with these, when the text is called the Thunder Perfect Mind, it's among them, like I say, this is a miscellany of these kind of texts. The text mirrors, I think, the I am statements that are in the canonical Gospel of John. So there's all kinds of different places where Christ says.
Okay, so we're going to stop it here. I think people get the idea of what's going on. You can see all of this is online in on the resources section, and we'll send it out. But this is trying to give you a more up-to-date picture of all of these discoveries since 1945 with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi codices. That what people have been piecing together was actually the full backdrop, and so it goes. So we're going to go on next time. This kind of concludes, I'm pretty sure, what we have to cover in East and West mysticism. And next time, I think we'll go on to Jung, and we'll take it from there.
Who considered himself to be a Gnostic, by the way.
Yeah, Jung considered himself to be a Gnostic, right? So the Gnostics win in the end, according to us. Any questions or anything before we break? I know it took a lot of time, but I thought there was a lot of good juice here, so rather let it rip.
One thing that occurs to me is that there was a figure of the devil in the story of Job, and I don't even know this. I'm wondering where where in the chronology is Job an early story?
Job is very early.
That's what I thought.
It's before. There's Genesis and there's Job, and then there's the rest of the Torah, the Old Testament.
Because there was a devil there tempting God.
Right.
That was, and Jung's fault. We'd like to do a separate course on this at some point, maybe in the summer, on the story of Job and Jung's work on it. But God was tempted by the devil, Satan, whatever you want to call it, into this test for Job, which I think is terrible.
Yeah, and we'll see what Jung thought of all that, but that's not for today. So, okay, it's been a long time, but thank everybody for coming. We'll see you next week, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.